Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is Milk Oolong Chai from Bird and Blend, which is an English company. Slightly off the traditional recipe of chai, but that's okay. It's still very good. And yeah, I really like this tea. I ordered it from England a while back, and that made me feel like I had something in common with one of the people I'm going to talk about today. So if you saw the title today, Snark Academia, you can see that it's a bit of, if you've heard of dark academia, you can see it's a bit of a wordplay, feeling a bit punny, I guess. Um, but it's because, well, when I heard about these things called aesthetics, one of them was cottagecore, which I thought was a nice little escape. You don't have to have lived in a cottage to enjoy it. But I think I liked even more the ones, the academias, the dark academia, light academia, etc., because it centers around pursuit of learning, a love for learning and scholarly stuff, which is basically what academia means. Um, when we think of that word academia or academics, anything academy, you really do think of a university because that is, primarily what the word means. But the actual word can also just mean love of and pursuit of learning in general. So that's why I was drawn to the look of it is pretty cool, but you don't really have to have the look of it to, I guess, be interested, but it's just that tends to be what you see the most of if you look it up. That's usually how it is. Everybody gets into taking pictures of things and showing off things. But it can just really be about book learning, which is one of my favorite things. And I thought, well, like the word academia, it does mean primarily going to college or university. I thought, what about those, however, who do love to learn, who pursue their own version of an education without the means of formal higher education, university, college degrees, that sort of thing? Do they have a place in the conversation, both on BookTube or just in general among other people who are learned? And I thought, well, over the years, there have been plenty of people, writers, um, people who are very intelligent or considered very intelligent or an authority on something to do with being smart, and yet they didn't have much of an education. And most of the time when you think of people like that, you hear the word or the phrase, the expression autodidact, which basically means self-taught. So I thought, well, what are some examples of people who were self-taught but are maybe still in modern-ish times still pretty well regarded by, I don't know, like I love the word learned, but people who have had educations. And what can we glean from this? Can it be possible to consider oneself educated despite being more self-educated? And of course, if you're learning from a book, you're not 100% self-educated because you are learning from the person who wrote the book. And I do believe just before I get into it, I do believe there are certain professions, obviously, that should require a bit of a degree. I mean, of course, medical. But even, I would argue, there are probably exceptions. But I'm someone who loves to read history books, not so much textbooks, but actual, books about history and time periods. And most of the best ones are written by people who have PhDs or masters or something in history. So that does say something, but does that mean someone who is really into books, someone who maybe wants to get into writing, for instance, what is their role? What can they do? Are they academics? So I thought of two people, one of whom I talk about a lot on this channel and elsewhere, and have read about and read their own works a lot over the years, and one who I've come to know a little more recently, but who I thought was very interesting. Both people who did not go to college, and for whatever reasons, and yet. So, okay, I'm very chatty today. I still want to drink my tea. It's kind of hard to intersperse that. But anyway, so the two people that I want to talk about are Helene Hanff and Fran Lebowitz. They have some things in common, I think they look more like each other than they look like me, as far as looking, as far as looks go. But that's not the main reason I'm using these two. They're both people I think that are known for being book lovers, and they're both people who are known as New Yorkers. Like very much when you think of New Yorkers, these are the kind of people that you might think of, especially slightly old school New Yorker, not terribly old school, but slightly. And they're like a generation apart. Helene Hanff died about 25 years ago, and Fran Lebowitz, at the time of this taping, nowadays you never know, is still alive. And oh my goodness, yes, but they're not native New Yorkers. Both of them grew up elsewhere. That's another story. I don't want to ramble too much, but so I'll just talk about their kind of self-education, their way of getting into life. And I'm not saying that because they were successful, that means that you too can be successful as a writer or whatever without an education. It's not all about success that I'm talking about. It really is just the pursuit of learning, and not learning for learning's sake, but learning out of an interest and going from there, I guess you could say. So I'll start with Helene Hanff, who, yes, like I said, I know a little more about, I think, because I've read memoirs of hers, and of course I've read 84 Charing Cross Road a ton of times, and of course seen the adaptation many, many times. That came out in the 80s with Anne Bancroft. And I found interesting because I had thought about her lack of education, because in one of her letters, in response to one of the, in 84 Charing Cross Road, the book she's most well known for, in case I forget to mention that, she writes to one of the ladies who worked at the bookshop Marks and Co., which was the bookshop she corresponded with, and she had never sent a picture of herself, and this is pre-internet where you couldn't just Google them, and so they didn't know anyone in the bookshop. They did not know what she looked like. So this lady, Cecily Farr, wrote about how people kind of theorized about what her appearance was like, and one person thought she looked very smart, and probably and someone else said, oh, I think she looks studious, because of the letters she wrote. And she was like, well, I definitely don't look smart, and I don't really look studious. I've never even been to college. And I remember reading that, and I thought, well, oh, okay, someone who is self-taught. So I just found that intriguing. It wasn't like expounded on too long. But then I found her memoir, or account, as it says here, Q's Legacy. And as you can see on top, it says, a delightful account of a lifelong love affair with books. I think we have the bottle and can cart going. I don't know what it is. I come here all at different times. Anyway, recycling. A delightful account of a lifelong love affair with books, which is the main thing that I enjoy about her, and of course Fran Lebowitz, which is going to come later. But she starts off this book talking about her version of an education. She talks about how she basically the time that she was brought up in, her coming of age was during the Great Depression. So there weren't as many I don't think she was in any kind of poverty, but there weren't a lot of financial opportunities. Like, oh yeah, just go to college. We'll just all pay for it and that'll be fine. You needed a scholarship, and she wasn't as well rounded in her academic excellence to be able to get a scholarship. Geography seems to have gotten in the way a little bit. The type of geography she talks about isn't like, oh my goodness, she can't even locate Britain on a map. It wasn't that. It was a little more, but I digress again. So yeah, she couldn't, at the time that she wanted to, she couldn't go to college. And she talks about starting to work in a bookshop, which is something that surprised me because I didn't know she ever did. But then she mentions in the course of this, because she needed to make a living, she was trying to really become a writer. That was her aspiration. She wanted to know how, so she goes to a public library around when she was 17 in Philadelphia, which is where she was born and raised. Okay. And she goes to the section that she's looking for books on, college books, and also about writing and literature, English literature specifically. And she finds a man's writings. And his name was Sir, apparently, Arthur Quiller Couch. Now I'm told that his name was pronounced Couch. It looks like couch to me, so it's hard to, you know how that is. But either way, he was a lecturer, professor at Cambridge, and he had been educated at Oxford. So she got books of his out, which I actually have. I don't have it near me right now. I have a number of his books myself. They're pretty interesting, but that's another subject for another time. So first she got his book about writing out, and she was reading his books. Basically, they were lectures, and they made a lot of references to different types of literature that she didn't know anything about. So she went on and, usually through the public library, acquired these books. And this, in her own way, she describes it as her education. She, she had to get work. She ended up working in and around the theater in New York, which she moved to eventually. So that was another type of education altogether. A lot of people in the theater aren't maybe as into English literature, or at least not at the time. I don't want to generalize, but even so, throughout her, I think, late teens and 20s and onward, she continued her own program of education through this man who was known. His nickname was Q. That's why it says Q's legacy. So she went and just used him to form her own curriculum, and it informed her own writing. Even though she wasn't like a runaway successful writer, it still helped her over the years. And these books that she became very well acquainted with, first they were library books. Then she tried to, get some copies of the books where she could, because she is a big rereader, which I'll talk about in another video someday about rereading. But well, I've talked about it already. But eventually she moved into her own apartment, where she wanted to get nice copies of the books that she had, and to obtain copies of the books that she didn't have. And this led her to write to the bookshop Marks & Co. After seeing an ad about them in the Saturday Review. And this led to years, almost 20 years of a correspondence between herself and Frank Dole, who was the main correspondent in the bookshop, and other people in the bookshop as well. It was just a fun business, but also friendly relationship. And this helped her acquire all these books that she wanted, and of course to learn about more books as time went on, and requesting books as years went on. It's a fantastic book. Again, I know everybody on BookTube seems to talk about this at some point, but if you haven't read 84 Charing Cross Road, please do. It is pretty wonderful. What she did, she says, is because she was a writer, and when you're in between writing gigs, you need to write. But I think she needed some kind of connection that people nowadays can kind of find, not always in person, IRL, but through the internet in some way or another. I remember a number of years ago, I was starting to read book blogs. That was my way of finding out these sort of connections. But for her, she didn't have anything resembling internet, and so she found a kindred spirit in Frank Dole and wrote to him all kinds of stuff discussing the books that she got a hold of, sometimes just talking about the condition of the books and making cracks about it, but also talking about what she liked about the different books that she read, aesthetically and content-wise. And it is wonderful, and I think that is why so many book lovers are in love with this book. But she also had a bit of a snarky attitude. That's where the Snark Academia comes in. I like, this is not something I'm trying to start, by the way. It's just a kind of a subject for me. She did have a way of being occasionally sarcastic and silly, and she had that in her correspondence. One letter of November the 2nd, 1951. Oh my goodness, like over 70 years ago now. She finally gets copies of some of the books that she's been waiting for a while. And she says, she starts out saying, "Dear Speed, you dizzy me rushing Leigh Hunt and the Vulgate over here whiz-bang like that. You probably don't realize, but it's hardly more than 2 years since I ordered them. You keep going at this rate, you're going to give yourself a heart attack." And that's just how she writes. And she right away says, "That's mean. You go to such trouble for me, and I never even thank you. I just needle you. It's mean. I really am grateful for all the pains you take for me." So she really did love this relationship, honestly. It's almost romantic, but it's not. It's romantic in a different sense, really. But I think that's what I love about her, is that she had that capability of just, getting a little bit of an attitude, but not being full on mean. And when she thought she was getting a little mean, she already, regulates it a little bit. And I think that sometimes, and I'm not saying this is 100% only people in this situation, but I think sometimes people who are autodidact, self-taught, who didn't have maybe the benefit of a lot of university educations, I think sometimes there is a little bit of a defensiveness almost. And I'm not saying that's what she was utilizing here, especially not in writing to Frank Dole, who I think also didn't have much of a university education himself, but knew a lot about books. But I do think that that can be a little inherent among people who've spent a lot of time in their own learning, just a minor, not like an overwhelming, but a minor snarkiness. But yeah, that is not just, just their capacity. But as far as clothes, she describes herself as being a little bit like frumpy and just dressing for a cold apartment. In further books, she does sometimes describe other clothes she wears. But if you were gonna go into the whole aesthetic thing, which I'm not focusing on for this purpose of this video, but if you do actually watch the adaptation from the 1980s with Anne Bancroft and Anthony Hopkins, etc., do look at some of the costumes. When I say costumes, the clothes that people are wearing. I particularly love what the ladies at the bookshop wear. Their clothes are they're kind of cozy. I would say if you're going to use the academia aesthetic, the cozy academia, like it is well suited for working at a bookshop in London, in the 50s, but still, even now, I would say. Although I don't know what it's like to work in a bookshop in London. I do know what it's like to visit it, and someday I may do that. But let's move on again, but let's move on to the second person that I was going to mention, and that is, ta-da, Fran Lebowitz. This is her book that I finished finally last month, and maybe I'll do a wrap-up on that, and maybe I won't. We'll see. I only came to know about in recent years. I'd seen her before. She had a couple of parts as a judge on Law and Order. And, you hear names around, but I didn't know her from the name-wise. I didn't know the difference between her and Annie Leibovitz, really. So I would hear the name and kind of think, is that the photographer? I'm not sure. But I watched a documentary called The Booksellers in early 2020 at a time when I was missing going to bookshops. And one of the people they interviewed to talk about bookshops, especially in New York, was Fran Lebowitz. And I thought, wow, she knows a lot about books, and she seems to be quite an authority on books. And it's one of the reasons I use this the Strand, because she does talk about the Strand among other bookshops that are still around. And she is quite the book reader. From what I gather, she owns over 10,000 books in her Manhattan apartment, which is not easy, but she doesn't go in for internet and a lot of other modern things, so she maybe has more time to read. I don't know. But so I thought, okay, so she knows what she's talking about. And then, of course, last year, Netflix came out with the special she did with Martin Scorsese, where he's laughing like at everything she says. I mean, she's funny, but she's not that funny. But anyway, she is actually, I think, even more snarky, much more snarky in her way, which doesn't mean that her whole life is about being snarky, but she definitely is. And if you watch anything in her interviews, she's always at least a little bit sarcastic, or at least a little bit cranky about stuff. And the name of this program was called Pretend It's a City, which can't get any snarkier, which basically meant that if you are encountering tourists walking down the street, looking at their phones, not paying attention to anything, and getting in the way of people who are just trying to take a walk in their city, she's just like, hello, pretend it's a city, pretend that it functions in a way that people need to walk down the street and not trip over you. So already I kind of like the title, but so I was watching her talk about different subjects, and she is quite the authority now. She's used a lot in sort of, I call it the lecture circuit. She goes around, at least she's starting to go back around to different places to give talks, to give interviews, and she's barely written anything. I mean, I think she writes articles, but like in terms of books, in ages. But she's just known for talking now. But a lot of what she talks about ends up centering around books and what she's learned. But when I looked into her and like, okay, so you know, what was her upbringing? What was she like? She grew up in New Jersey, moved to New York, I think in her late teens or very early 20s, and was a high school dropout. Basically, she says she was kicked out of high school. Um, she uses the word algebra as a curse word, which I kind of find relatable. I was pretty good at math until I hit algebra, and then it was a little downhill. But it's not about me, right? So, and yeah, so she didn't go to college, despite the fact that her parents apparently, as she said in an interview in her 40s, at that point even her parents would have paid for her to go to college. So it's not like she had zero opportunity to do so. She just didn't. I have a feeling she didn't really like the atmosphere of the school system or something. But for all the reasons that she didn't go to school, that didn't mean that she didn't try to make a go at it as a writer. When she moved to New York, she tried different jobs. Eventually, she did end up working, making whose magazine? I think it was Andy Warhol's magazine, and writing various articles. Not becoming an overnight success, but becoming rather well known, despite, like I said, despite the lack of education. She just worked hard, I guess you could say. She hustled, and she was even a taxi driver at one point. But in one interview, she said she would spend time hanging out with some friends that were going to the new school. So she definitely, wasn't shying away from the university areas, which I also relate to. I honestly love being around a big university campus. I love the area around Columbia University. I like the area around Harvard when I went there, and Oxford in England was a fantastic trip for me. But again, I digress. How many times did I say I digress in this video? But she ended up doing a lot of that, not just what you know, but who you know. She was a lot more social than one would think by seeing someone like her. She spent a lot of time, I think, in bars with certain types of people, just conversing, making connections, and that helped her to get where she was at today. But mostly what she did, I think, in terms of education, was read books. That was a lot of what she did. Life was an education, and reading books was an education. And that's all, to her opinion, that's all she needed. So examples in her writing of her snarkiness is, well, just one thing I will read to you is, let's see, I'm going to read one paragraph in this one essay called People. People, a group that, in my opinion, has always attracted an undue amount of attention, have often been likened to snowflakes. This analogy is meant to suggest that each is unique, no two alike. This is quite patently not the case. People, at the current rate of inflation, in fact, people especially at the current rate of inflation, are quite simply a dime a dozen. And I hasten to add, their only similarity to snowflakes resides in their invariable and lamentable tendency to turn, after a few warm days, to slush. So you would think she hated people, but she seems to be kind of social. She says in interviews that she likes parties. So yeah, it's a little bit of a balance, but generally what she seems to like more than anything is spending time reading books or looking for books. And that's why she's known. This is her most famous quote. Yeah, let's read this one paragraph that she wrote in this one essay called Tips for Teens. And she writes, "Think before you speak, read before you think. This will give you something to think about that you didn't make up yourself. A wise move at any age, but most especially at 17, when you're in the greatest danger of coming to annoying conclusions." So I thought that was a pretty good point. Maybe instead of thinking you're all that, as they used to say, read other people's writings. Listen to other people before you jump to conclusions. So I like that. I like that about her. Just briefly about her style. She does have her very own style. As well, you can't really tell in this picture because she's wearing a coat, but she tends to wear either a black or sometimes, well, it doesn't matter, like a blazer with a shirt and usually jeans of some sort or pants and or trousers, I should say, and boots. And it's like her look. She's had a similar type of look for years when she was, an up and coming writer. But somehow, yeah, somehow, even though she's not the most prolific writer, somehow her writing was put together to the point that she was on shows like David Letterman by the early 80s, to promote her books and talk about her thoughts. And she gives, like I said, she gives talks, she gives interviews, even at colleges. And again, she is known as an authority on books. So, does this mean that this is the path one should go, go for? The path of Helene Hanff, who makes up her own English literature syllabus, or the Fran Lebowitz, who, drives taxis, does all kinds of odd jobs, and then suddenly finds herself known for being Fran Lebowitz? I don't know. Not necessarily. And when I talk about these people, I just use them as examples of different people who went a different way than the, okay, go to high school, go to college, eventually start your career. But this, I believe, can apply to people who even went to school. You may have studied something along the lines of English literature or history or stuff like that. Or you may have taken a more of a business course direction, or you may have studied something like medicine, or you may have gone to a trade school, and you may have a decent job, a decent situation, or not. But I believe that one's education should keep going if you want it to. Books are not the only method of education, of course. There are so many different ways to learn. Observing nature is important. Socially, being with other people, talking to them, asking them questions is an education in itself. But learning from books, whether it is through literature or reading nonfiction, which I definitely recommend, is just something that I believe should keep going. And I know I'm preaching to the choir by talking about this subject on a booktube channel, but I thought it just my observations, just my little chat here. And it's not to put down people who've had a university education or have not had one. It really is just that there is, in my opinion, a place at the table for everyone, as long as you have that love for learning. It's just a different perspective. So I hope you've enjoyed this little conversation. I don't think it was incredibly snarky. I just kind of like I said earlier, the wordplay. Now this is getting to be a bit of a long video, but I hope you've enjoyed it. And let me know what you think. What other autodidacts, there are so many of them, are you fond of? People who didn't get to have a university education, maybe like Virginia Woolf, who wasn't able to go to school, but was able to have a room of her own, perhaps. So let me know what you think. For now, this is Catherine at Taking Tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day.